invite you to remain standing for our scripture reading. We'll be reading from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5. Let's read God's good word together. Soon a large crowd of people had gathered to listen and be healed of their ailments. As often as possible, Jesus withdrew to out-of-the-way places for prayer. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. How is your relationship with silence? Whenever you needing to say something to fill it, or maybe you're afraid oh gosh, poor Brandon, he forgot what he was going to say. There's not a lot of silence to go around our world right now. And we know that we need more of it. But then when we experience it, a lot of us get super uncomfortable. We're like, okay, bring back the noise. That wasn't so bad. I don't want to face whatever is coming for me. That's what we're going to talk about today. What happens whenever we are faced with silence and solitude? Something that all of us need, and yet that we have a tendency to run from. We've been going through the last few weeks talking about surviving the wilderness, leaving comfort to find life. And we've been looking at the wilderness stories of the Bible. It's a special place where God meets the people of God. And I've been sharing about my experiences of 2 weeks in the wilderness of southern Utah with an army poncho and a wool blanket and a knife and not a lot else. And what I've learned and what we can learn together from the scriptures about what it means to live in the wilderness. Because eventually we all find ourselves there. We all find ourselves in a place where something is taken from us that we had previously relied upon. Sometimes that's a relationship, we lose someone, or a relationship is broken that we previously relied upon. Sometimes it's a job that we took our identity from, and then we're laid off or we retire, and we've got to figure out, who am I without this? Or some other comfort that we've been taken. We run out of coffee, and the store is closed, and we've got to figure out, who am I if I don't have caffeine to get me going in the morning? All of these things we have to figure out, because one of the things that we learn from the wilderness is that the wilderness teaches by taking away, not by adding, but by taking things away. And whenever those things are removed, that's when we have to figure out and to learn things about ourselves. And that's where we started, was in the first week of the series. We talked about Jesus' temptation in the desert. Now, after he was baptized, he went into the desert for 40 days to fast and to pray. And we talked about the practice of fasting, which has been really a staple of Christian practice for centuries and has fallen out of favor in the last few. And if you were here for that week, you heard John Wesley was shocked in his day that some people only fasted twice a month. And I know it's shocking that people fast so seldom, right? And now you're weirdly religious if you fast twice a month. We're like, whoa, what's going on? What kind of denomination are they part of? But that's been part of our tradition, because whenever we fast, it helps us to realize what's really driving us, right? You take away food and the comfort that we get from it, and we start to realize whenever we get hangry, I'm not as patient as I thought I was. There's some things going on that I've been able to ignore that are coming up now that I've got to deal with. And so we learn that. And one of the things that we do whenever we take things away, when we intentionally deprive ourselves, we are able to focus on the essential, because we've gotten rid of the inessential. When we take away the inessential, we can focus on what's essential, on the things that actually matter most. So that was week one. Week two, we talked about the fact that many of us are trying to live superhuman lives. We're going to achieve more than anyone has ever achieved, and we're going to be more productive than anyone who has ever produced. And we're going to do it all while meanwhile staying in shape and maintaining healthy work-life balance and all of those things, right? And how many of us are doing that really well right now? It's not super easy, and it's because we have to recognize part of what makes us human is that we're limited. We're not infinite. Only God is infinite. And yet we forget that although part of what it means to be human is having the spirit of life breathed into us, we're also made out of dirt, right? That's what we read in Genesis chapter 2. And that's why every Ash Wednesday we say, from dust we have come, to dust we shall return. It's a reminder that we are part of the earth and we're dependent on it. And the very basic needs that we have of needs for food and water and air, they remind us that we depend on God and the world that God created. And that's part of what it means to be human, is to depend on those things, to be people who are made of the earth and who depend on it, because that's how God made us. And so that's where we've been the last few weeks, I've shared with you about some of the things that I've done for the first little over 2 days of our trip. We hiked a lot and we didn't eat a single thing. Fasted for about 54 hours, and we learned a lot about ourselves doing that. After that, we came to what we called survival camp, and we weren't moving much. We were staying in the same camp, and in order to eat, we had to kill a ram and then process it, and that's what fed us for the next 3 days. And we learned about survival, about how to make shelter, how to make fire, and those kinds of things. And after that, we went out and we started learning about navigation, and we were back on the trail again. So this was about 5 days into our 2-week trip, and we got to hike through some really beautiful area. There were 11 of us, students, and 3 guides, and we began learning. And as we were there, we encountered things. We realized there were people there before us. Who knew, right? We weren't the first people to walk on that ground, but we saw some artifacts from ancestral Puebloan people, and we saw this grindstone that thousands of years ago someone was using to grind grain. And so you can see a demonstration. That's Jeremy, our guide. He's got a little stone there and is kind of demonstrating how that might have been used. But it was this connection with people who have gone before us, who were finding ways to process the food that they had gathered. Thankfully, we did not have to gather grain and then grind it. That would have been a little more than I signed up for, I think. But we got to see these really beautiful sights and also recognize that, like in this canyon, that the watermarks on the wall went higher than our head. We thought, okay, I'm glad it's not raining. That would have been a bad place to get stuck. That gives you a better idea of how tall that was, and also how bad I am at taking photos. You can see my finger up top. And anyway, I'd say I'm working on that, but I'm really not. It is what it is. And we learned important skills like finding shade on a really sunny day. And so if you can see in the top right, my friend John is hiding out. And we learned to make trails where there were not trails and how to get through and bushwhack. And got to see some really beautiful views and how to identify where water was. And so if you look on the left, you notice it's greener than over on the right because there's a creek down there. And so things would grow where there's water that won't grow otherwise. And we particularly look at the trees that were around. And if you saw deciduous trees that have leaves that fall off, not like pine trees, you know that there's water because they require more. And so if you're thirsty, you look for deciduous trees and head that way. And so that's one of the things that we learned. And just got to see some beautiful canyons and really unique geological features. And at the end of the long day, it was really good to get some food. And our all-purpose cup was what we ate out of, and a wooden spoon that my friend John made for me because I was slow and I was still trying to make my fire kit. But I appreciated him sharing. And that's what it looked like sleeping. We could have made a shelter, but it wasn't going to rain, and it seemed like it was warmer if we just put our ponchos directly on top of us. So that's what we did, and just made our way through that way. And got to stay in this really cool alcove. We said a little prayer that no rocks would choose to fall at the moment that we were sleeping underneath that. I mean, it had taken thousands of years for those big rocks to fall, right? Anyway, we were fine, and got to sleep in a really cool area. And we found out whenever we got there that the next day they would take us to different sites, and we would each spend 48 hours completely alone. And they would drop us off. We'd have about a 1/4 mile by a 1/4 mile, and we would just have to use the skills that we had learned and figure out how to make things work. And if we could make a fire, then we would have dinner. And if we could not, then we would not. And if we could remember how to set up our shelter, then we'd have something over our head. And if we couldn't, then we would not have a shelter. And so we divided up food. We did not have to kill anything again, thankfully. That was a one-time experience. But we'd have oats for the morning. We would just pour water in and have cold oatmeal. And we also had some like powdered milk and sugar that we could put in that. For lunch and snacks during the day, we had gorp. Anyone familiar with gorp? There are different recipes, but what ours stood for good old raisins and peanuts. I think you can also have granola, oats, raisins, and peanuts. We were way less fancy than that. So just 2 elements, and that was lunch. And then at dinner, we had the organization I went with was called BOSS, Boulder Outdoor Survival School, and they called our dinner Boss Stew. And so it was made out of lentils and quinoa, and then we'd slice up onion and carrots and potato and garlic, and we had some flavoring, thankfully, for it. We had this like veggie bouillon, but somebody accidentally ordered the sodium-free version, and so it's not like it was super flavorful whenever it's full of sodium, but even less so. And anyway, the desert teaches by taking away, so no sodium for us. And we just had to make do. But that's what it looked like. And then so at night we'd make a fire, and then that's what we would cook the stew over the fire, and that's how that worked. And so the next day we started hiking, and we hiked down this game trail that went along a creek, and we would just come to an area, and our guide would set up some rocks, would make a little cairn, and would say, okay, this is your site. And then we'd keep walking, we'd drop off someone next, and then we got to, I think I was the third to last person. I was thinking, so we're getting further away from where the guides are staying. It must be because I'm so competent that I'm the third to last. I think it was just random, but I'm going to stick with that. But so they finally got to my spot and dropped me off, and then they kept walking. And I was like, okay, I've got this whole space, and it's all mine. And it doesn't really care whether I'm here or not. It doesn't really care if I survive or not. I've got to figure it out. And so there was this rock outcropping that I climbed up, and you can see it. This is the area that I stayed in. And so it went basically to this like canyon wall, and then over, let's see, to about here. And then all the way, if you can see the lighter trees, there's a creek down in that canyon, and it went down to the creek, and so that's where I'd get water. But all of this area, it felt kind of like Mufasa, everything the light touches. That is, but anyway, I didn't feel like a king for very long. And so that was the area I got to stay in. So whenever I got there, I started looking around and trying to figure out where to set up my campsite. What's the best area that will kind of shelter me from the wind. And I tried one, and I didn't like it. And so I had set up my poncho in a shelter, and then I took it down and set it up somewhere else, and then I decided that was worse, so I stuck with the first one. And then on day 2, I found an even better spot. So I set it up 3 times. There was lots of duplication of labor. The third spot was great, though, and this is what that one looked like. And so I had my tent set up in the red scarf. It's a shamag. That's where I hung my food, so mice did not find their way in and give me less to eat. And then I've got my other stuff just kind of sitting there. And, nothing like a bandana to hold down just put a rock on top of it, and you can tie down your shelter. They're pretty handy. And if you need to blow your nose, you've got them for that too. So we learned lots of things are multiple use. And for dinner, so after I got my shelter set up, then I went and started trying to find a spot to cook, because if animals were attracted to my food, I didn't want them also to end up where my shelter was. And so I found a different spot and gathered some wood to light the fire, and got that going. The video that, if you were here last week and saw the video of me starting a fire, that was actually the first night of the solo portion of this. And so that's what my stove looked like. Just cooked it directly in the cup. This was not a good setup. The rocks, I could not get it to where it would hold the cup while also allowing good airflow. And so it went out a lot. And I was doing a lot of blowing on the coals to reignite it. And thought at one point maybe I was going to be having to worry about smoke inhalation. I didn't, thankfully, because I was alone. And if I didn't have lungs to blow my emergency whistle, that was not going to end well. But fortunately, we did have some measures in place to let people know you were okay. And so they'd set up the cairns on the edge of our areas. And in the morning, whenever the sun went up, you would walk to the upstream side of your area, and then you would take the rocks and you would set them up. And then when the sun went down, you'd go to the downstream side and you would take them down. And so if you went to one side or the other, and if they were supposed to be down and they weren't down, then you would know that the person next to you had not done that. And so you'd check on them. And most of the time, if they were not set up the way they were supposed to be, it meant they forgot. So you'd yell, "Hey, are you okay?" And they say, "Yes, sorry, I forgot." But that way we were covered. We knew that we were safe. And we wouldn't go more than 12 hours without someone checking on us. And so, as long as you're not, as it's not a major hemorrhaging situation, you're probably okay. And anyway, so it's better than nothing. And but we had that going on, and I was successful the first night. Got the fire going, kept it going long enough to cook, and that is what boss stew looks like. And it was very tasty. Whenever you're super hungry, it makes stuff really good. And I had enough time just before that to get back to my shelter before dark, because if I had not gotten there by dark, then I would not have found it, and I would have just been sleeping under the stars without a blanket. That would not have been cool. So I'm glad I was not in that situation. So I was pretty, really that first half day whenever I got there, I had things to keep me occupied. I had to set up camp and make sure that I was ready for dinner and able to light that, and then get it cleaned up and get back to where I was staying, and said evening prayer and went to bed, and then woke up the next day. And then I had an entire day that I had to figure out what to do. And so, went down to the creek, I got water and purified it, and then I had water to drink. And it had been a while since I'd been able to do laundry, and so I washed my clothes. So 2 weeks, I washed my clothes twice. I wore the same thing every day. So we smelled great. And so if you saw last week, my laundry setup was I dug a hole in the ground, then I put down a plastic bag to keep the water from just running into the dirt. I upgraded for the second time. I had 2 basins, and so you'd wash in one and then rinse in the other. And that was great. And after 2 items of clothing, then the rinse water was totally dirty. And so anyway, I went through a lot of water and had to make multiple trips back to the creek, and it took a super long time. And then afterward, I washed my socks, which you can imagine was necessary. And then I hung them up to dry. Unfortunately, after that, I did have sandals, but one of the problems with my area was that there were a lot of cactus there, and they were hard to avoid, and I ended up pulling a lot of those from my feet. And I had kind of an adversarial. I was like, God, what are you trying to teach me in this? But then, so that's what I kind of focused on, and then got the laundry done, did a little bit of carving. Really kind of where my brain kept going was just thinking about my family. I'd been away from my kids probably 10 days, been away from Courtney, and just started thinking about them. So I was carving little gifts for them. They turned out, I wouldn't say they turned out great, but my whittling needs some work. And that's how I kind of spent my day, and then went through the evening routine as well. But it was strange because, I was in this situation where for 48 hours I had no contact with anyone. I didn't talk to anyone at all. I don't think I've gone that long ever without seeing someone, and I've certainly not done that without internet access. Right? I've not been able to turn on a TV to fill some noise or to be able to scroll to keep my mind from wandering and or experiencing feelings that I don't want to. That was a really odd situation because really we live in a situation now of solitude deprivation. You have to look for solitude today to be able to actually experience that. And that's not always been the case. I mean, that to a large extent, that wasn't even the case 30 years ago. Solitude was once our default state whenever other people weren't around. Like if you were a farmer and you were going into the field to work, you were in solitude, right? That was just how it was. And now it's nearly extinct because first the radio came along and then TV and then these little devices that can access the entirety of human information that has ever been collected just with a few clicks. And in the process of that, we're able to access all these great things and entertain ourselves all the time, but we've lost the ability to be bored, right? I mean, that's a novel experience now. Like whenever my kids tell me I'm bored, I'm like, yes, finally. Like, they don't ever experience that. It's like, but you need this. And we've got all of these things like TV and YouTube and podcasts and audiobooks. They enable us to have a constant stream of input coming in. We don't ever have silence because we can just continue to have those things. I mean, you think about just the statistics, the number of people who sleep with their phone right next to their bed. It's most of us. And there's even a surprising number of people who sleep with their phone in their hand. And so I don't know if that's like I want it to wake me up if somebody texts me, or if it's just you fall asleep with your phone in your hand. But one way or the other, it's a non-trivial percentage. And also like the number of people who take the phone into the bathroom, I wonder if like anthropologists are going to look back and say, in the early 21st century, we saw this spike in the amount of time that people spend in the bathroom. It's really weird. And maybe not. Maybe anthropologists aren't interested in that kind of thing. But we just, almost nowhere can you be alone with your thoughts. And eventually they're probably going to make like waterproof phones that you can take in the shower so you don't even have to have that time alone. But that's the situation that we're in. And this is how Ruth Haley Barton describes it. She says, I can become exhausted by the intrusion of the media and technology into every corner of my life, resulting in constant overstimulation of body, mind, and emotions. All of this convenience wears me out. And do you know when she wrote that? 2006. It's like, what technology was wearing you out? Did you know like 3 people who had a BlackBerry? Like the iPhone wasn't even invented yet. And even then, she was feeling that. And has it gotten better? No, it has gotten exponentially worse in the last almost 20 years. And with distraction easily at hand, we run the risk today of losing the ability to endure uncomfortable emotions because there's always an out. We don't have to sit with it. we can just numb, we can just distract, we can just scroll, and we don't have to deal with those uncomfortable emotions that are bubbling up. And this is not a new phenomenon. If you think 2006 seems like forever ago, this is what Dietrich Bonhoeffer said in the 30s or 40s. He said, "We are so afraid of silence that we chase ourselves from one event to the next in order not to have to spend a moment alone with ourselves, in order not to have to look at ourselves in the mirror." Does that ring true for anyone? And we're so afraid of this, and this is not new, but it's a lot easier to run now. We've got a lot more at our fingertips that helps us to escape ever having to do that. And not only is it uncomfortable to be in silence and solitude, but in our achievement-focused culture, it feels like a waste of time. Like, why would I do that? I'm not being productive. What do you mean, like I'm only folding laundry? No, I'm going to be listening to a book and folding laundry, doing two things at once. I'm going to listen to a Spanish podcast so that I will improve my fluency, or maybe people don't do that, but we just think that like I have to be accomplishing something at every moment, and stopping feels like, it almost feels sinful, right? And yet it's almost like God gave us this commandment to stop on a anyway, probably making stuff up. But what we see is the opposite in Jesus' life. He sought out solitude. It's not just something that happened once or twice. Throughout his ministry, he had a rhythm of being with people and then withdrawing to solitude, being with people and then going again to solitude. And it wasn't like he spent all his time away from people, but he had a rhythm of being with them and then going back. And that one enabled the other. And so we saw in week 1 that he spent 40 days alone in the wilderness before beginning his ministry of fasting and praying and preparing for the things that were coming for him. After that, he came back and he started preaching and doing ministry and healing people. And after a long night of healing, he withdrew and spent time alone in prayer. We read it in Mark 1. He says, "In the morning, while it was still very dark, Jesus got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed." And this wasn't like Jesus went for like a year and then he took some time away. He had just gotten back from 40 days in the wilderness. And yet this was his rhythm. And we don't know exactly how much time passed. I think time is tricky in the Gospel of Mark. Like everything happens immediately. And it's like, okay, Mark, you say immediately. Does that mean like same day, like same minute? But what we know is it was soon. And so it wasn't like he waited months and months, but that he had this rhythm of doing this regularly, probably daily. And he would do this before making big decisions. He spent time in solitude before choosing his apostles. Luke says, now during those days, he went out to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. Not just a little bit of time, he spent the night in prayer. And when the day came, he called his disciples and chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles. Now, when he was choosing the apostles, this wasn't like a low-stakes decision. This was his succession plan. Like, these were the people who were going to be leading the church after he ascended into heaven. And so this wasn't something that he was like, we'll roll the dice. Peter, like, I guess he's okay. Like, he'll be the foundation I build my church upon. Like, no, this was an intentional decision. And so he spent the night alone with God in prayer in preparation for that. And that included then, as he prepared himself for the night in which he gave himself up for us. The night before he was crucified, he spent the night praying until he was arrested. And this is how Luke tells it. Jesus came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives. The disciples followed him. When he reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Then he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Now, that is a hard prayer to mean. It's a hard prayer to say, but it's also hard to mean. And I've prayed it more often than I've really meant it. Like, God, whatever you want done, but really it needs to be this that I want done. And so whatever, as long as it's this, right? I mean, you know that prayer. The reason Jesus is able to pray that, and not just about anything, but about his very life, was because he had been shaped by time and solitude. That wasn't one isolated incident, but an entire life building toward being able to say yes to God in that moment because of that rhythm, spending time in solitude and prayer. And so if Jesus needed that, it might be possible that even 21st century people, as sophisticated as we are, might need to spend time practicing solitude. Do you think? Like, maybe. Definitely. Because it's not something that we just need today because we're so plugged in and just going all the time. It's something that people have always needed. And it is important for us to unplug, to kind of let our brains defrag. Do you remember doing that like with your Windows computers 20 years ago? Maybe they still need that. But just kind of, you've got to do that to keep them running smoothly. Like we do need that, but that's not the purpose of the Christian practice of solitude. The primary purpose of that is really to create space to be with and to listen to God. All the other benefits are important, but really the reason that we go into solitude is to spend time with God because it's a relationship that matters. Do you have relationships that are important to you where you don't spend time and listen to them? Okay, probably the answer is yes for most of us, but do they go well whenever you're treating the relationships that way? Probably not. If we're not spending time together, we're not getting closer. If we're not listening to each other, we're not growing in that relationship. We need that. And so we take time to step back and to be with God and to really listen, because whenever we're never listening, even good things can become distractions from God. Whenever we're not listening, even things like prayer and Bible reading can become distractions from God. Right? Because I'm just reading to fill the void. It continues to be an input that I'm taking in. Then it's like, okay, thanks God, I'm going to go do what I want now. Or we're praying and saying, here, God, all the things that I want you to do. And also I have this really hard decision that I need to make. And if you would just tell me how I need to make that decision, but I'm gonna stop praying now and go on and do a bunch of stuff. So if you could just like write your answer so that I can read it, that would be helpful because I'm not going to stop to listen. Right? I mean, we're just like, okay, God, thanks, figure it out and let me know, send me a telegram, whatever, and then we're off. And if we're only like taking in, we're never stopping to listen to God, those really good and important things can be distractions. John Mark Comer talks about it. He spent 21 days on a silent retreat, not for the faint of heart. I'm not game for that yet, maybe never. But what they told him is that he could not bring any books, and he could bring the Bible, but try not to read it too much, because it could be a distraction. You could use it as a way to avoid spending time with God because it's an input. And we do want to do that, though, because whenever we are in silence, we face the parts of ourselves that we like to ignore or avoid, or that we know are true, but we try not to know. Like, I'm trying not to see that right now. But things come up whenever the silence is there. Like, right, during that was just like 10 or 15 seconds at the beginning of the sermon. Did that feel like forever for anyone? Right? I mean, it's just like we start to feel that. And sometimes solitude can feel like pouring water on a fire. Like, it's good that the fire is out, but now there's all this smoke, and there's a lot of it. And it's kind of like that whenever we're so used to noise and then we're all of a sudden in solitude and in silence. It's just like there's smoke everywhere, and your brain is like, thank you for getting rid of the noise. Now here is everything on your to-do list that you have not accomplished because you're such a terrible human being that can't get all your stuff done, right? Or here are all of the things that you've ever done wrong. Let's recount those and the emotions that you were feeling at the time in complete detail, right? The stuff just kind of comes out. And that's one of the hardest parts of entering into solitude, is getting through those first few minutes of just kind of like the embers of the fire continuing to smoke and just sitting through that. But we have to wait through that if we're ever going to wait until the air is clear. If we're going to get through clarity, we have to wait for all of that to clear. But whenever we do, that gives God space to work in us on the things that we normally don't see. And this is how Adele Calhoun puts it. She says, solitude is a formative place because it gives God's Spirit time and space to do deep work. When no one is there to watch, judge, and interpret what we say, the Spirit often brings us face to face with hidden motives and compulsions. We can see those things that normally we just take for granted or ignore. The world of recognition, achievement, and applause disappears, and we stand squarely before God without props. We just are who we are, and that can be scary, right? That's what was scary for Adam and Eve whenever it says that they hid. Right? They were scared of being seen by God. But do you know that God sees you either way? It's kind of like whenever you're growing up, like I would have this kind of revelation about myself, and I would like tell my mom, and she's sitting right here, and she'd be like, oh yeah, I knew that. It's like, well, why didn't you tell me this? It was because like you couldn't hear it, right? You had to get there on your own. And it's kind of like that. There are things that God knows about us. God knows it all. And yet waits for us because it's like, okay, I could tell you that, but you're not going to be able to receive it until you get there. You've got to get there on your own first. And whenever we spend time in solitude and silence, that's what gives us the ability to get there, to recognize oh, I am seriously jealous of my neighbor who has a bigger pool than I do or who has a better car than I do. And I've thought that it was just them. Like, no, that it's me. And we figure those things out when we spend time in solitude. And so it's something that we know that we need, and we want it maybe. It's like going to the gym or eating right sometimes. I really want to do that. But it doesn't have to start with a 21-day silent retreat. John Mark Comer can do that because he is who he is, and Brandon Blackson's never going to do that, and I'm okay with that. But it can begin with as little as a few minutes, and it can grow even into weeks, but it doesn't have to. But we start where we start. And we start where we are. And so it's important for us to create space for that practice in order to be able to spend time with God and grow that relationship. Now, there are a few things that I think are helpful to know about what solitude is not, because it's easy to get it misconstrued. Solitude is not just being alone. It's not the same thing. And we can think sometimes that like being alone is spending time in solitude. Solitude requires intention because the purpose is spending time with God. And so I can be alone and not be in solitude. And I can also be alone and have inputs continuing to go, right? TV on, phone in my hand, or whatever it is. That's not solitude. It requires intention. It requires quieting voices and stepping away from those things. Solitude is also not me time. I love me time. I think it's great. Yesterday, I spent like 2 hours in the hammock on my back porch. There are certain inputs that live in my home that I was trying to get a little bit of space from just to rest. And it was great, and everyone was happier because I was in a better mood. But that's not solitude. Like that was Dad getting some me time, and that's great, and it's important. But it's not the same as just getting away from people. That was just me hanging out on the porch in the hammock, and also, in case it's helpful, it's not just for introverts. All of us need it, and some of us may be more wired for it, although it may be that we're more wired for being alone and not necessarily in solitude. But it's for everyone. Each of us needs that, and for some people, that'll be easier than for others. For some people, it'll be like, I can do half an hour and it's no problem, and some people will get to 10 minutes and be like, I feel like I just fought the Battle of the Bulge, and I barely survived that. I've got a colleague who is really extroverted. She's like opposite of me on that scale, and she sits in silence every day for 20 minutes, and she says sometimes she wants to pull her hair out whenever she's doing it, because that's not the way that she's wired, but she recognizes that she needs that, and all of us need that, because it's not just for spiritual masters. It's not just for people who are super far on the path, or for monks, or people who have loved Jesus forever and done it apparently perfectly. It's for all of us. Each one of us needs to spend time in solitude. Because this is how Henry Nouwen puts it, and he puts a pretty fine point on it. He says, without solitude, it is virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. We do not take the spiritual life seriously if we do not set aside some time to be with God and listen to Him. And that sounds almost a little harsh. And then you think about, like, is there any relationship in my life that I can say I take seriously if I don't spend time with them and I don't listen to them? It's just relationships 101. We've got to have that. And so if we want to have a relationship with God, if we want to live a spiritual life, we have to set aside that time in order to be with God. Now, it's also important to recognize that just going away, like the ideal is not becoming a hermit either. Like that's not what solitude builds toward. It's not an escape from other people. What it actually does is it gives us the space we need so that we can be more fully present whenever we re-engage with people. That's what we see in the life of Jesus. He didn't just escape to be a holy hermit that people sought out. He would withdraw, and then he would re-engage. And what solitude enables us to do, the Desert Fathers were a group of people who around the 4th century escaped to the desert. They felt like, Thomas Merton describes it as, they saw society as a sinking ship, and they were trying to get clear of the wreckage. But the reason they did that was so that then they could help others. And so what they did, what solitude enabled them to do, was to die to their neighbor. That's the language they used, dying to their neighbor. Like, who would have thought a bunch of people who ran out to the desert to escape society would have a flair for the dramatic? I don't know. But that's how they described it, dying to their neighbor. And what they meant by that was dying to our neighbor means dying to my need to compare myself to the neighbor, to see if I size up. Do I have the social status that they have? Do I have the same amount of wealth that they have? Or it's never the same amount. Do I have more than they do? Am I more important, or do I look better? All of those kinds of things. We're able to die to our neighbor, and we're able no longer to use them as the measuring stick that we use to measure our own life. We're able to stop judging them, because a big part of that is recognizing whenever I step into solitude, I'm confronted by those things that I don't want to think about. I'm confronted by my own stuff, by the things in my life that need to be set right, the places where I still need God to heal me. And whenever I'm aware of those things, it's a lot harder for me to judge you, because I'm so aware of that in myself. Like, you've got stuff, well, I can one-up you. I've got my stuff too. When we're aware of that, then we're able to relate to the other person without feeling the need to judge, and we recognize that there's someone that we can help. Solitude gives us the solid ground that we need so that we can lift up our neighbors in love. And if you think about if a lot of time people today feel like we're drowning, have you ever felt like that? Like just trying to keep your head above water. Have you ever been in the pool next to someone who needed help and they pulled on you, and what happened? Like, you went under. Right? Is that helpful? It is for them for a second. It's not helpful for you. And then you pull them under to get back up. What solitude does, it enables us to get out of the water, and then we're on solid ground to be able to actually help them up. It gives us the space that we need so that we can actually be present and helpful to people. And particularly when we think about the season that we're in a nation with an assassination attempt on a presidential candidate, there's a lot of chaos in the world. And what I know is I can't change that. I am who I am. I have one vote. I control the behavior of one person, and even that is questionable sometimes, how well I can control that. But if I can spend time in solitude, then I can become a person who is more centered, who is less reactive, and I can bring a little more sanity into the world, and I can be helpful to the people around me. And one of the ways that we can make our society more safe, more just, less prone to things like political violence, is by spending time with God and allowing God to work on the things in us that become reactive and bring more chaos into the world. It enables us to become people of peace, who live lives of peace, who take peace into the world. And so we're not going to solve all that today, but I do want to invite you to take a step. And so here are action steps for today. First, I just want to challenge you to choose a time each day to spend in solitude with God, and commit to a certain amount of time. And if this is new for you, you might just try 5 minutes. I say you can start with as little as you want. I think it helps to start with 5 minutes. Like, you've just got to get through those first few minutes. And so I think there may be a minimum effective dose kind of effect here. But try starting just with 5 minutes and just ask God, give me a prayer that helps me to be present to you. And if you're not sure where to start, maybe start with Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. And you can just pray that and have that be a way that helps you to be present to God and spend time with God in that way. And the amount of time doesn't matter nearly as much as the consistency. And so you can go to the gym and you can max out one day and show everyone how strong you are, but if you take the next 6 months off, are you going to get stronger? You're not. That's not how it works. And so you can do like 2 hours of solitude, but if that makes you never want to do solitude again, like maybe not helpful. And so 2 minutes a day is much better than 2 hours once. And so just show up. I mean, that's like 80% of the spiritual life is just showing up. And when you become distracted, not if, but when, because that's how our brains work, gently return your attention to God. Not, Brandon, you idiot, you're distracted again. Why were you thinking of your to-do list? You're so dumb. You're so unholy. What's God going to do? How are you going to preach to people if you get, right? Those kind of thoughts pop up in our head. And so instead of like being like, kind of tightly fisted, like, okay, I'm distracted. I'm in my to-do list. I'm going to turn back to God now. There's this beautiful story. Father Thomas Keating was one of the people who helped share about the practice of centering prayer, which is one way of practicing solitude. It's basically a form of prayer where you're really just seeking to spend time with God and be present. It's a nonverbal form of prayer. And he would lead these workshops and would help people to learn the practice. And there was a woman at one of the workshops he was teaching, and she was really getting frustrated. She was like, I have had 10,000 thoughts that have popped up while I'm trying to do this. And his response is so beautiful. He said, how lovely, 10,000 opportunities to turn back to God. Isn't that beautiful? And so every time we're distracted, it's an opportunity. Anytime we get things wrong, it's an opportunity to turn back to God and to rest in God's presence and to grow in that relationship. And then as you progress, as you get your 2 or your 5 or your 20 minutes in, you might consider setting aside a half day or a full day or even longer to spend in retreat with God. And there are lots of great spots to do that. Pastor Mark and I would be glad, or any of our pastors, Pastor Tim and Pastor Robert would be happy to talk to you about that. There's a great spot in Tulsa, the Abbey of the Heights. I've spent time there before. I'll go back and just spend that time with God. It's a really beautiful experience because whenever we take the time to go and to allow God to shape us, it transforms the way that we are in the world. Will you pray with me? God, we thank you that you are always with us. And sometimes we forget that because there is so much noise, there are so many distractions. And I pray that you would help us to cut through the noise and to step out of it so that we can be with you, so we can listen to you, and that we might be changed through that encounter. We thank you that Jesus shows us the way. And we thank you for his faithfulness and for his love. We thank you that he taught us even how to pray, saying, "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen."